Just before dawn, while most of Asia was still asleep, a Japanese destroyer entered the Taiwan Strait. Not a press release, not a statement of concern, not another carefully worded protest from Tokyo, a warship, and not just any warship, a Japanese destroyer moving through one of the most politically charged waterways on Earth. 48 hours after Russian corvettes had arrived in China for a high-profile naval visit, and after weeks of Chinese pressure had been building across the East China Sea like a tightening fist, that is the image to hold in your mind. Dark water narrow channel, Chinese radars tracking every movement, warnings coming over the radio, a Japanese ship continuing anyway. Because the real story is not that one ship crossed one strait. The real story is that Japan has now decided Chinese pressure no longer buys Japanese restraint. That is the change. For years, Beijing has relied on a very specific method against Japan, Taiwan, and everyone living inside what Chinese planners think of as their near seas. You do not always have to start a war if you can slowly train the other side to live inside your pressure. You flood the zone with Coast Guard ships, you push maritime militia into disputed waters, you conduct blockade rehearsals, you close airspace, you turn maps into instruments of intimidation, you make your rivals wake up every morning asking not how to win, but how to avoid the next incident. That is how coercion matures. It does not begin with an invasion. It begins with repetition. Repetition turns abnormal actions into routine facts. Routine facts become accepted limits. Accepted limits become political reality. And what happened in the Taiwan Strait is important because Japan just interrupted that process in public. Beijing wants every country in East Asia to believe that the Taiwan Strait is a place where Chinese preference carries special weight, where foreign militaries may pass only at the cost of Chinese anger, and where over time even powerful countries will decide it is easier to step back than to keep testing the line. Tokyo just refused that logic. A Japanese destroyer did not enter those waters because somebody in Tokyo suddenly wanted drama for its own sake. It entered because Japan has spent months watching China turn pressure into structure. The passage was not an impulsive act. It was the visible answer to an accumulated problem. And to understand that problem, you have to stop looking at the strait as an isolated event and start looking at the wider board. China has been building pressure on multiple fronts at once. Around the Senkaku Islands, Chinese Coast Guard and maritime forces have treated Japanese waters like a laboratory for endurance testing. The goal is never just the immediate incident. The goal is to ask a larger question over and over again. How many ships, how many days, how many warnings, how many intrusions before the other side internalizes the message that resistance is exhausting and Chinese persistence is permanent. Then there were the militia swarms, civilian, looking fishing fleets carrying strategic intent, boats that do not look like warships, but operate as extensions of state power. Gray zone pressure is valuable precisely because it forces the target into an awkward choice. If you overreact, you look unstable. If you underreact, you invite more of it. It is coercion designed to blur the threshold of response. Then came the rehearsals that mattered even more. The attempts to constrict the air and sea space around Taiwan. The message embedded in those exercises was obvious enough. If Beijing can normalize temporary restriction, it can make the idea of a larger blockade feel less like a crisis and more like the next step in an already familiar sequence that matters enormously to Japan, because Japan does not sit outside this map, it sits inside it. When Chinese pressure expands around Taiwan, around the East China Sea, and around the choke points of the first island chain, Japan does not see a local episode. Japan sees the outline of a future in which its shipping routes, its southern approaches, and the balance of power around Okinawa and the Ryukyus all become more dangerous and more uncertain. That is why this passage through the Taiwan Strait has to be read correctly. This was not merely about freedom of navigation in the legal sense. It was about Tokyo signaling that the old pattern is no longer acceptable. If China keeps pushing the map outward, Japan is now prepared to push back in ways that are visible, military, and impossible to mistake for diplomatic theater. And the timing made the message even sharper. Russian warships had just arrived in China. That visit was not a random courtesy call. It was part of a broader image. Both Beijing and Moscow want the region to absorb two revisionist powers coordinating in Asia. Two militaries comfortable operating around Japan as periphery, two capitals, reinforcing the idea that the Pacific balance is shifting and that the countries caught between them should start adapting psychologically before they are forced to adapt strategically. Tokyo answered that image with steel. That is why the transit mattered. It punctured a performance. Beijing and Moscow wanted the region to watch a picture of growing partnership and expanding pressure. Japan made sure the next picture the region saw was a Japanese destroyer moving through the most sensitive waterway in East Asia while China watched and protested, but did not physically stop it. That is not a small thing, because one of the hidden rules of regional intimidation is that the threatening side needs its targets to participate emotionally. Fear does not have to defeat you militarily if it can discipline you politically. Once the target behaves as though the threat already governs its choices, the threatening side starts winning without having to take the ultimate risk. Japan's transit said no, and once you see that, a deeper framework becomes useful. I would call it the pressure threshold. Every state under sustained coercion has a threshold beyond which restraint stops looking prudent and starts looking like surrender in installments. Stay passive, and you buy temporary quiet at the cost of a worse strategic position later. Protest only in words, and you tell the coercing power it has found the maximum pressure you're willing to absorb without materially answering, escalate recklessly. And you may hand your rival the crisis it wants. The difficult option is the middle option, the visible move that does not start a war, but does redraw expectations. That is what Japan chose. The destroyer S-Transit was not designed to win a battle. It was designed to alter the psychology of the board. And there is a reason Japan, of all countries, is especially sensitive to that board. Look at the geography. Strip away the rhetoric and just look at the map from Japan, southwestern islands down toward Taiwan. Runs the first island chain, the line of maritime terrain that Chinese strategists have obsessed over for years, because it narrows Beijing's pathways into the wider Pacific. Inside that structure, certain passages matter more than others. The Miyako Strait, the waters around Okinawa, the approaches near the Senkaku, the Bashi Channel further south. These are not abstract labels. They are gates. For China, gates are constraints. For Japan, gates are leverage. That is why Chinese pressure near the Senkaku is never only about the Senkaku. It is about loosening the grip of a geographic system that Beijing sees as limiting its navy and complicating its ambitions. It is about changing the facts of movement. It is about training neighbors to behave as though Chinese presence in those approaches is routine, legitimate, and ultimately irresistible. Japan understands that perfectly well. And this is where a lot of outside commentary still gets the story wrong. People look at Japan and think in outdated categories: cautious, defensive, constrained by history, reluctant to display military assertiveness, more comfortable sheltering under American power than demonstrating its own. That Japan is disappearing, not because Japanese leaders suddenly became reckless, not because pacifist instincts vanished overnight, but because the environment around Japan has changed enough that the political price of passivity is now rising faster than the political price of visible resistance. That is the real transition. China helped create it. Every Coast Guard incursion, every militia swarm, every airspace closure, every rehearsal for strangulation around Taiwan, every combined signal with Russia, every effort to normalize the idea that East Asian waters can be psychologically managed by Beijing. Each of these pushed Japan closer to the conclusion that the old style of answer no longer works. The old style was delay, protest, caution, and de-escalatory language. The new style is different. The new style says, if you keep pressing militarily, we will answer militarily, but in controlled, deliberate, highly legible ways. That is why one ship mattered so much, because it was not one ship, it was a doctrine becoming visible. And once that doctrine becomes visible, you have to ask what supports it. Japan did not gain confidence out of thin air. A state only sends a destroyer through a zone like that when it believes the move rests on something larger than symbolism. So what has Tokyo been building? First, it has been building reach. Japan is no longer content with a self-image built around static defense close to home. It has been expanding the tools that let it project credible force across the exact maritime spaces where Chinese pressure is most active. Destroyers, upgraded missile ranges, more serious attention to the southwestern islands, more serious attention to anti-ship capability, more serious investment in operating across the chain rather than merely behind it. This is not the posture of a country hoping geography alone will save it. It is the posture of a country preparing to contest the geography actively. Second, it has been building mobility, the conversion of large helicopter carriers into platforms capable of operating 35Bs matters, because it changes the map from China's perspective. A runway fixed on land can be targeted, tracked, and measured. A mobile sea-based air platform is different. It complicates timing, it complicates response, it gives Japan a more flexible way to shape air power around disputed waters and choke points. Third, it has been building lethality beneath the symbolism. The quiet growth of Japanese undersea capabilities matters because in a crisis, narrow maritime exits become far more dangerous when the force holding them can disappear as well as strike. Surface transits get headlines, undersea deterrence changes calculations. A Navy thinking about breaking outward has to think not just about what it sees, but about what it cannot see. Fourth, it has been building political permission. This may be the most important layer of all. Military hardware matters, but without political permission, even advanced hardware sits inside a narrow script. What has changed in Japan is not simply that it owns more useful military tools. It is that the domestic and strategic case for visibly using them has strengthened. China's own behavior did much of that work. Pressure that is too constant eventually reorganizes opinion on the other side. The argument that visible firmness is dangerous becomes harder to sustain when people conclude that weakness invites more danger, not less. So yes, the transit itself was dramatic, but the thing beneath the transit is more important. Japan is moving from guarded endurance to active denial, and that takes us back to China because Beijing now faces a problem it helped create. If China does nothing in response, countries around the region notice that the wall of intimidation has seams. They notice that a Japanese destroyer crossed the strait and China's answer for all the language remained political rather than physical. They notice that pressure does not automatically produce submission. They notice that repetition can be broken. But if China raises the level of military pressure too sharply in response, it strengthens the very coalition dynamics it says it wants to avoid. It intensifies Japanese defense planning. It pushes regional states closer together. It gives Washington even more material to frame Beijing as the accelerating source of instability in trying to enforce psychological ownership. China risks creating a tighter ring of strategic resistance. That is the trap. And Russia's presence makes the picture even larger. From the north, Moscow remains a live security problem for Japan because the unresolved territorial dispute, the military activity around the Kurils, and the shadow of Russian Pacific operations all force Tokyo to think in two directions at once. China is the dominant strategic problem, but not the only one that matters because it pushes Japan toward a broader conclusion. If pressure is coming from multiple angles, symbolic hesitation in one arena can invite more confidence from adversaries in another. In other words, the Taiwan Strait transit was not only about Taiwan, it was also about the total message Japan wanted both Beijing and Moscow to receive. That message was simple. We will not be psychologically partitioned. And that may be the single most important line in this whole story for years. China's gray zone method has depended on partitioning responses. One incident here, another there, a Coast Guard clash in one zone, a militia swarm in another, air pressure in another, a blockade rehearsal around Taiwan, a partnership signal with Russia. Each event can be discussed as a separate case. Each can be explained away as local. Each can tempt the target to answer locally rather than strategically. Japan is beginning to answer strategically. That is the real shift. It is connecting the dots. It is looking at the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the first island chain, Russian naval signaling, and the future of Pacific access not as disconnected episodes, but as one pressure system. Once you do that, the logic of the destroyer transit becomes obvious. A pressure system this integrated cannot be answered with isolated diplomatic notes. It has to be answered with a move that tells everyone watching that the target has understood the system and is willing to contest it in visible form. That is what Tokyo did. Now, this does not mean Japan humiliated China in the cheap online sense. It does not mean one ship erased Chinese naval power. It does not mean Beijing has lost its advantages in scale, shipbuilding proximity, or escalation capacity. What it does mean is more precise. It means China failed to turn accumulated pressure into uncontested psychological ownership of the field. That failure matters because once psychological ownership fails, every future act of coercion becomes more expensive. You have to do more to produce the same fear. You have to escalate harder to recover the same aura, and the harder you escalate, the more resistance you may consolidate. That is why this one transit belongs to a much larger story about Asia's future. The future is not simply a story of rising Chinese pressure and shrinking regional room for maneuver. It is also a story of how the countries under that pressure adapt, harden, coordinate, and eventually stop treating intimidation as the natural climate of the region. Japan is one of the clearest examples of that adaptation because it combines geography, industrial capacity, naval competence, alliance depth, and now a growing willingness to turn those things into legible strategic acts. That combination is serious, and it means the waters around Taiwan, Okinawa, the Senkakus, and the wider First Island chain are entering a harder phase. Not because war is inevitable, but because the old formulas are breaking down. Chandan Ishin's formula was pressure without full-scale conflict. Pressure strong enough to alter the board before a war ever became necessary. Japan's emerging formula is controlled defiance, visible enough to block normalization, measured enough to avoid handing Beijing the crisis script it might prefer. Those two formulas are going to collide again, not once, repeatedly. More ship passages, more militia encounters, more air incidents, more patrols, more legal arguments wrapped around military facts, more attempts by Beijing to make the region adapt to Chinese pressure, more attempts by Japan and others to prove that adaptation is not automatic. That is why the destroyer in the Strait matters. It was not the end of a story. It was the opening shot of a new chapter in which Japan is no longer content merely to absorb pressure and register concern. And if you want the hardest version of the conclusion, it is this. The real story is not that Japan sent one ship through the Taiwan Strait. The real story is that China's long campaign to make East Asia behave as though Beijing already owns the psychological center of the map just ran into a country that has decided to stop living inside that script. That decision will outlast one transit. It will shape every crisis that comes next. Because once a country stops acting intimidated, intimidation has to become force. And force is far more dangerous, far more costly, and far harder to control. The Pacific is moving into that harder age. Now, the old Japan that absorbed pressure and hoped the storm would pass is fading. The new Japan is not trying to hide from the storm. It is trying to change the storm's direction. And that is why Beijing should worry less about the ship that crossed the strait and more about what that ship announced. It announced that the era of uncontested pressure is ending. It announced that the first island chain is not a passive line on a map, but an active strategic barrier defended by states that have started answering back. And it announced something even larger than that. It announced that in East Asia, the next phase will not be defined by who shouts the loudest. It will be defined by who can absorb pressure, answer it visibly, and keep climbing without blinking. That is a much more dangerous contest than the one we were in before, and now it has begun.